Hey, it's Peter with the Garden Family.
And Hilary.
And in this video, we're going to answer more questions about starting onions. We did a video recently, had a great response. A lot of people really liked the questions we were answering, but we didn't answer all of them.
And some of you actually commented on our account asking very specific questions that we are planning on answering today.
The other thing we're going to do is, these were the onions we actually started last time. And so we're going to show you how we pot those up into bigger cells. So let's get right to it.
So one of the questions we were asked is, why bother starting your seeds in a to-go container instead of a cell?
Yeah, that's a good question, because you'd think it was maybe just an extra step to start them in here rather than just putting them in here if I'm going to spend some time doing that anyway today. Really the main reason is that onions have really variable germination. In fact, let me grab one of these other ones.
Yeah.
So these are Patterson onions that are a year old. You can see significantly less germination in this one than this one. So what ends up happening is, if you put them all in here, you're going to have a bunch of cells that have no onions, or you're going to overseed them to try to make sure you have at least one in there, and you're going to have a bunch where you're having to cull them all off. So the great thing about doing it this way, you can use your older seeds and just use the ones that germinate, and we're going to be sure, and you'll see, that each cell has one onion seedling in. So that's why we like to put them in the to-go containers first. Remember, we sowed these 2 weeks ago, and we're going to put them in here now, and they'll live here till we plant them out about 6 weeks from now.
Yeah. So another question we've been asked is, do your containers need drainage holes?
No, they don't. A lot of people are pretty scared of that. I found it's just much easier to not have drainage holes in these. Remember, they're only going to be in these for 2 weeks. This is basically the end of their lifespan there. And the first week, you don't water them at all. They have that little humidity dome that goes over the top. You've had the moistened soil, and you basically just leave it there until the onions germinate. After that, we've watered them maybe 3 times or something like that. You just need to be sure not to, completely saturate it where they're just sitting in water.
Yeah.
That's the one risk of not having drainage holes.
So a pretty popular question is, can you skip the indoor seed starting and just directly sow outside?
Yeah, that's a good question. That would also save a lot of time.
It would.
And I do agree, we've invested a decent amount in our seed starting room, and not everyone has a setup like that. You don't need a setup quite this robust, but at least where we grow onions here in Southwest Ohio, Zone 6B, we really would not get very large bulbs if we didn't start them indoors. So why is that? Let's go back to what we talked about at the previous one. Onions use day length to decide when to make a bulb. And so no matter what, they are going to make a bulb in the middle of summer. So if we start them in January, we get them pretty big indoors. We plant them outside. Now the plant just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And when it hits that threshold to make a bulb, the bigger the plant, the bigger the onion bulb. If we planted them outside mid-March, just as seeds, soil's really cold, probably 2+ weeks for germination. Now you got this tiny little onion coming up in April. It just doesn't have enough time to become a big, robust plant. So if you get any bulbs, they're going to be pretty small. So at least where we grow, I definitely recommend start your onions inside. If you can't do that, then you should go back to those sets or transplants. They do have a little bit higher risk of bolting that first year, but that's better than just putting seeds in the ground.
Another question we had was, how do we transplant the onions from these to one of the cells?
Well, let's do that right now. Why don't you grab the phone, and then I've already started some of those, and I'll show you how we do these.
Perfect.
All right, let's get started. We have 72 cell trays, so pretty standard tray, and then we also have a bottom tray that has no holes. These 72 cell trays do have holes. And I like when they have these little circle in the middle, because you can push out the root ball when you plant them. So let's go ahead and just get a little bit of soil in here. Always recommend that you keep a bin of pre-moistened mix. We did have a question about what kind of mix we use. It's going to be awkward because Hilary's going to be turning around. But we use Pro Mix. That one doesn't have it, but you can see this is the one that we're using. They come in these compressed bales. I think this was somewhat expensive. I think it was $56, but it's actually a ton of seed starting mix. This thing weighs like 70 pounds or something like that. All right, let's get back over here. So we're just gonna fill these up with our mix. And for those of us who haven't met the whole family, this is Shango. He's our Rhodesian Ridgeback. He's very interested in what we're doing. I think he's more interested to see whether or not it tastes good. I've got my 72 cell tray. I've just put some of that Pro Mix that we talked about already in there. You can see I transplanted just a few of those. These are Patterson, and let me show you kind of how I do it. So it's nice to do it in this little bin. I'm just gonna turn this over. You can see all of the roots right here. I don't really mind reusing the mix, so we're basically just gonna tease these apart. And the onions we'll kind of bring over here. You'll see what we do with all these roots here in just a second. So now that we've got our onion starts, one of the things you're going to find is the roots are actually somewhat long, and that's going to be a little problematic as far as getting them into the 72 cell trays. So one of the things I'm going to do is just cut these roots so they're a little bit shorter. Now I can see just some short roots here. And now when I go to transplant this one, I can just create a small hole here. Now as far as how deep to plant that, you're going to see just that little onion bulb, that little bulge right here. I'm just going to have that be under the soil, the rest is going to be up. Now that I've trimmed the roots, I can get in there much easier and just firm that down. I'm going to get to the rest of these, but I will speed up the video so you don't have to watch me plant all of these in real time. Once we're done here, we'll get back to some questions.
Okay, another question. What about the tops of the onions? Do you trim these?
We do, yeah. Actually, giving your onions a haircut, it's kind of what I like to think about, is something we do during the growing process, usually a few times. So what's going to happen is these onions will get pretty tall, and then when they're all in their 72 cell trays, as they get tall, they'll kind of flop over and they'll lean on each other, and it'll make it so there's uneven light distribution. So they really don't mind if you just kind of trim the tops of them off. Usually to keep them about 6 inches tall. Short enough that they kind of just stand straight up and they're not flopping over. And that's definitely something you want to do. I usually give them a trim right before I transplant them as well, just so they don't have to support quite as much foliage there.
And they look prettier when they're trimmed.
I mean, that's the real reason.
When they're in the garden. They
do better if you keep them trimmed.
So speaking of planting them outside, how far apart and how deep do you plant the onions when they go out?
Good question. A pretty common question that we had with people asking on the first video. So I like them in rows that are 6 inches apart. And so there'll be rows here, 6 inches apart there. And then last year I actually shortened the distance between the onions to 4 inches.
I remember.
Yeah, which is closer than I've done in the past. And we still got good sized onions.
They were great.
So we'll probably do that again. So 6 inches apart, the rows are 6 inches apart, and then each onion is 4 inches apart in the row.
And I think we did that to maximize space in other beds.
Yeah, the year before
right?
we had really, really big onions, and we actually wanted more medium-sized onions than just a few
big
onions.
ones. All right, so we talked about how far apart they're spaced, but how deep do you plant them?
About 1 inch to 1.5 inches deep.
Oh.
So
That seems shallow.
Yeah, not too deep. Basically, when you're looking at your onion start or your little plant, you'll have kind of the white part. That's where the onion bulb will eventually form. You kind of want all of that to be under the ground, but they're pretty shallow.
Wow.
Pretty shallow roots too. It's actually one of the reasons why it's really important to keep your onion beds weeded, because they don't compete very well with weeds. So 1 to 1.5 inches deep.
There you go. Okay. Another question is, do you ring your onions? Which I don't even know what that means. So
ringing your onions is the idea that as they get close to bulbing, you kind of take away some soil around the bulb.
Kind of expose it?
The idea of it is it allows the bulb to kind of get bigger without the soil pushing against it. We don't ring ours for 2 reasons. One, I've never really noticed it to make any difference. It's kind of tedious when you have 200 some onions in a bed. And then our soil is, the raised bed soil that we use is really kind of soft and fluffy. So as the onions bulb, it's really easy for them to just kind of push out. When they get bigger, they actually sort of pop out of the soil. So I don't, if you ring your onions and you think it's beneficial, let us know in the comments, but we don't ring them at all and it works just fine.
Yeah, doing fine. All right, last question. Can you talk more about fertilizing indoors versus outdoors?
Yeah, and I put that on here just because people, even though I talked about it in the last video, people had a lot more questions about that. So indoors, we use water-soluble fertilizers. We prefer inorganic fertilizers. Easiest one to get, just something like Miracle Grow. I know there's a lot of people out here that think those are really bad products. If it's not for you, it's not for you, that's fine. But they work pretty well for us. The main thing is you just have to dilute it a lot. If you want to do the math, it's about 50 parts per million of the nitrogen component. I'm not going to go into how to calculate that because it's a little bit complicated. If you're really interested, you can Google it, it'll probably tell you. Or maybe AI will these days. But kind of easy way to do it if you're using Miracle Grow, it's that ½ teaspoon in 3 gallons is generally what we go for our starter. You can about double that once the onions get established. We've used organic soluble fertilizers as well. I know some of them say they're not too stinky. They've all been stinky. And so right underneath our kitchen, that's probably the biggest reason we don't use the organic fertilizers. The other thing is you're not really establishing a soil ecosystem
inside
in a 72 cell tray. And so it's really just not that important to stick with organics there. So now we switch to outside. Outside, there we are year by year trying to build that soil ecosystem. And so there we prefer organic fertilizers. In our soil, the phosphorus and potassium is already perfectly fine. We do not need to supplement that. And if you've been gardening for a little while on your beds, it's probably the same there too, because those tend to stick around. So most people are sort of over supplementing with those. So using a balanced fertilizer where a 10-10-10 or something like that is probably not the right thing to do. If you're not sure though, you can do a soil test and it'll tell you. But basically all we do is add some supplemental nitrogen with blood meal. We talked about those 6-inch rows. You can basically just side dress with about a cup per row. We'll do that a few times during the growing season, usually about 3 times. You're going to stop really kind of early June because once they start bulbing, they don't need the nitrogen because they're not trying to grow the plant part anymore. I hope that makes sense. I wish there was a easy, just do this outside as far as fertilizers go, but everyone's growing conditions are so different. It's inside you can have just do this and it'll work.
Completely controlled.
But outdoors you really have to know your soil, realize what's going on, and then react to it.
Well, I think that sums up the questions that we were asked recently, and maybe we'll have even more after today's video. Possible.
I hope we've answered pretty much all the onion stuff. Hopefully you guys aren't too overwhelmed with the overwhelmed onion things. They are somewhat confusing plants, but
they are
really rewarding to grow. We always use all of them.
And they stay in our cabinet. We have probably 75 onions that are still good. They haven't started growing green
that we
tops.
harvested in July.
We harvest them in July and I use them so I don't have to buy onions at the store.
Yeah.
And it's amazing.
We did have a comment saying, don't grow onions, they're so cheap. And
I like to grow everything.
Well, I'm going to give you a hint. almost anything you grow in your garden is probably more expensive than what big ag does.
It's true.
They have huge machines, they have millions of acres, they rip up the soil, they dump chemicals in it. It is cheaper, but it's not better for the environment. It's not better for you.
Right.
We like to know where our food comes from. Like to teach our kids
Less
where our food
consuming,
comes
it's more
from.
creating, and it's a big thing, so.
So if that's your philosophy and you want to see how our onions do and how the rest of our garden does, consider subscribing to our channel and follow along. Happy gardening, everyone.